Welcome back for a second episode on methodology in the social sciences. Because of the complexity of this topic and its relevance for democratic research, it deserves more than one podcast episode. After Matias Lopez's conversation with Jake Bowers, which you can go back and listen to right now, we continue this mini-series on methodological puzzles with another special guest, Tasha Fairfield, Associate Professor at the Department of International Development of the London School of Economics and Political Science.
Well, hello, Tasha. Thank you for joining us. It's so good to see you again. And just let me start by asking, how are you doing?
Things are going well, and thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and talking about Bayesian methods with you.
Great. This is a series on methods. It's methods for democracy. And, when we think about methodological training, we often have this image of the PhD student going to graduate school, and hopefully she or he will have a couple of courses on methods and read some interesting books, which rely a lot on a tradition of statistics and statistical modeling of our thought, no pun intended there. But then when they go to the field, they travel abroad, right? And in the process, sometimes statistics seems like it doesn't make sense anymore, and people start having an attitude towards statistical thinking and take other methodological directions. Now, one thing I find exquisite and fascinating about your approach is that, among other things, it brings statistics back to case analysis and to what's called qualitative research. And you do so through what you call a Bayesian reasoning. So I would start by asking you, Tasha, what is it about this Bayesian reasoning, and how does it differ from other traditions in research?
Yeah, so I can just start by very briefly explaining how this works. So we're using probability theory to help us do better inference in qualitative research. And the idea is pretty simple. So we are social science detectives, and our goal is to go out and get our hands on any and all information we can to help us figure out what's the best explanation for whatever it is that we're studying, whether that's how did democratization come about in South Africa, or why was South Korea able to put on a very effective COVID response early on compared to other countries. So rival hypotheses are going to play the role of the different suspects in a detective novel. And we use the clues that we find in news archives and historical records and interviews and secondary literature to figure out who done it. So namely, which of those rival explanations best fits the evidence that we uncover. So to put things in slightly more technical terms, we start out with some rival hypotheses to compare. We assess our prior odds, namely which hypothesis do we initially find more plausible based on the literature that we read and our general understanding of how the world works. We gather evidence and we evaluate its inferential strength by asking which hypothesis makes the evidence more expected. So here we have to imagine a hypothetical world where a given hypothesis is true, and we ask how well our evidence fits with the kinds of things that would make sense in that world. Then we imagine an alternative hypothetical world where a rival hypothesis is true, and we do the same thing. In technical terms here, what we're doing is we're evaluating what's called a likelihood ratio for the evidence by asking which hypothesis makes that evidence more expected. And then at the end of the day, we're going to update our prior odds in light of the evidence that we obtain to get our posterior odds on the hypotheses. So Bayes' rule tells us that whatever our priors were, however plausible we thought the one hypothesis was relative to another from the outset, we should gain more confidence in whichever hypothesis makes the evidence that we obtained seem more expected. So it's about applying Bayes' rule and the laws of probability to help us reason about qualitative case evidence and to help us reason under conditions of uncertainty.
Great. I find this fascinating. You're not the first to talk about the Bayes inspiration for these 4 case studies, although, you did a terrific work in formalizing it in a very clear and applicable way. Now, if we dig a little bit deeper, we'll see that this idea of bias reasoning being suited for case studies relates a lot to the literature on process tracing, right? So you didn't mention process tracing yet, but the process tracing is a latent variable in your earlier response, and that relates to Andy Bennett and so many others. Could you tell us whether there's a difference between Bayesian process tracing and non-Bayesian process tracing? And actually just clarify maybe to folks who are not familiar with it, what process tracing is.
Yeah, so that's actually a difficult question because I think process tracing means really different things to different people, and there's sort of different schools within what one might think of as process tracing. Properly applied, I would say that Bayesian process tracing simply involves applying Bayesian reasoning, as I just described it, to qualitative case studies. And you're absolutely right. We're very much drawing on and building on work by Andy Bennett and McCune before then, and Van Everett to some extent as well. There's a sort of Bayesian thread running through all that earlier work. And we're sort of bringing in Bayesianism as it's used in the natural sciences to push that agenda further. Now, I would say that the most common variant of non-Bayesian process tracing would be what I would call mechanistic process tracing. First of all, tracing the causal mechanism can certainly be helpful, and that's sort of a feature of a lot of qualitative research. But it's not enough from a Bayesian perspective. So inference always requires asking whether the evidence is more or less expected under arrival. And here you have to remember that evidence which is expected under your hypothesis might actually be even more expected under arrival, in which case that evidence is actually going to undermine your hypothesis, right? And moreover, all sorts of clues that are not directly related to the causal path from X to Y can contribute to inference. So really any evidence that's more likely under one hypothesis relative to a rival is going to boost the odds in favor of that hypothesis. What that means is that Bayesianism lets us leverage many more kinds of clues and more kinds of information than a strictly mechanistic approach.
Right. So it's not about the kind of data that you get, but how you formalize your assessment of its likelihood in contrast to alternative hypotheses. Correct?
Yes, so the alternative hypotheses are really central, but also Bayesianism allows you to use and to look for and to focus on many more kinds of clues and evidence.
I see. Now, Tasha, I find it very interesting that you opposed just now Bayesian process tracing to what you called mechanistic process tracing, right? So intuitively, one would think that the opposite of Bayesian process tracing would be frequentist process tracing or something similar to that. If we dig deeper in this tradition, we'll find the 1990s infamous or famous KKV's Designing Social Inquiry, right, which created a huge fuzz and an angry reaction by so many. And King, Keohane, and Verba, they focused a lot on measurement error and bias. They seem to build on the law of great numbers to some extent, and with this mantra of more observations. Do you think that was a possibility for a frequentist version of case analysis? And if so, is that the only frequentist framework possible, or can we think of others?
Yeah, so I would call the KKV, I would call that sort of a paradigmatic effort to fit case studies into a frequentist framework. And in fact, I think a lot of standard advice for case studies is grounded in frequentist thinking. And that's especially true when it comes to case selection and research design. But that's actually quite problematic. And we would say that that kind of agenda to understand qualitative research or case study research within a frequentist framework just cannot work. And why is that? Well, the problem is that frequentism simply cannot accommodate non-stochastic qualitative evidence. You really need a Bayesian framework to be able to understand qualitative research. So according to its own foundational principles, frequentism can only analyze data from processes that could be modeled as a coin flip or the roll of a dice or some kind of random sample. But it really does not make any sense to think about the information that we get from key informants or historical records or participant observation in those terms. So in contrast, Bayesianism accommodates essentially any and every kind of evidence you might imagine, far above and beyond sort of data from some kind of stochastic process.
I see. Yes, that's definitely a harsh take on it, but convincing nonetheless. But I was thinking of Fisher's teacup experiment and the distribution of data and how data would look like in the world of rival hypotheses. But then you come to the bridge between frequentist statistics and Bayesian statistics. But yeah, I get your point, and definitely think that the Bayes approach is a powerful way of reintroducing probabilistic reasoning to case studies and case analysis. Now, in the other side of the room from KKV, there is this other trend among methodologists or so-called qualitative methodologists that really wants to divorce completely case analysis from statistics, right? So you have approaches from Gertz and Mahoney, for instance, that link case analysis with set theory, right? And before that, you have qualitative comparative analysis, which a name that frustrated a lot of students that when they went to study the method, it was pure algebra. But the idea is kind of the same, of applying Boolean algebra and looking at reality as shaped by sets. And that implies the sufficient conditions, necessary conditions, and that kind of causal reasoning. And that got a lot of people excited. QCA was broadly applied until some people started to show with replications and simulations that it fails a lot of the time in capturing causal relationships, that it is too sensitive in several circumstances, and that kind of seems to be fading away now. So would you say that we are back to probabilism, or is this still a struggle within the discipline of methodology?
From a sociological observation perspective, I would say that QCA still seems to have some pretty strong holds. My impression is that it's more prevalent in Europe than it is in the US. But that aside, I would say, we absolutely do need probability theory. So to give you my critique of that sort of approach, I would say the really fundamental problem with QCA is that set theory or Boolean logic only applies in context of strict necessity and strict sufficiency, right? Where the truth values of all propositions can be known with certainty. So as soon as we have any uncertainty and we're forced to deal with incomplete information, which is, the situation that we are essentially always facing in the real world, then we're no longer in the realm of Boolean logic. And that's where probability theory comes in. So physicists, including Cox and Jaynes, have actually proved that Bayesian probability is the unique extension of ordinary Boolean logic to contexts of uncertainty and limited information. So Bayes' rule and all the other basic rules of probability actually just automatically reduce to Boolean logic when the values of all probabilities equal either 0 or 1. So probability theory is a way to take us into that realm of incomplete information and uncertainty. And then I guess I should also mention, if we're talking about set theory, if you're using fuzzy set theory instead, which is sort of another alternative that's out there, you're actually quantifying vagueness, whereas probability theory quantifies uncertainty. So they're very different things. And we would say, my co-author and I would say that that's quantifying the wrong thing. You want to quantify uncertainty.
Couldn't agree more. Now, you mentioned your co-author, Andrew Charman, right? You wrote a couple of pieces with him, and you have an upcoming book on this Bayesian method. Now, could you tell us a little bit about the book? And I understand that Charman is a physicist at Berkeley. So how does that interdisciplinary methodological work comes about?
He is he does logical Bayesian data analysis for his day job. That's, he's very interested in Bayesian probability in all contexts. So in a quantitative context and also in any other context, we sort of build on some of these articles that we had published previously. And the goal is to just sort of lay out this entire technique, introduce Bayesian probability, show how to apply it in qualitative research at a number of different levels, at sort of a very basic level, and then at sort of deeper levels or more explicit levels as well. And then in the second and the third parts of the book, we talk about Bayesianism and methodological perspective, so addressing sort of a lot of the questions that you were asking me just before. And then the last part of the book sort of turns to research design and explains what Bayes would have to say about case selection and test strength and iterative research and all that good sort of research design stuff.
So getting back to this, bias versus frequentism, it's one among many proposed divisions in methodology in general, right? So you have many others of these families of duality. So there's observational versus experimental. The other episode with Jake Bowers, we talked about design-based versus model-based, which is a very interesting conceptualization. And you have the classic qualitative versus quantitative, which seems to, put people really, it generates a lot of animosity for some reason. How do you relate with those divides, and especially the quantitative qualitative divide? Why do we get so upset about this kind of subdivisions?
I would say, I think it probably goes back to KKV and the fact that the prevailing epistemological approach in political science is frequentist. And qualitative case study research really just does not fit into a frequentist framework. You can't understand it, you can't interpret it within a frequentist framework. So you need Bayesianism. But I would say that this quantitative-qualitative divide really comes from frequentism. And in fact, it only really exists within a frequentist perspective. So once you adopt a Bayesian perspective, it really just fades away. And why is that? Well, it's because Bayesianism handles all evidence in the same way. We're always evaluating likelihood ratios, where we're asking which hypothesis or which model makes the evidence more expected. And then the same goes for these other divides, observational and experimental research, or within case and cross-case data. And so all those distinctions that shape so much of the methods literature really just fade away within a Bayesian framework, because we're always using the same inferential technique to evaluate what the evidence has to say about how plausible a set of rival hypotheses are.
So could this Bayesian approach be a way to finally get into a model for mixed or multi-methods? That has also been a discussion of, how to combine statistical analysis with other kinds of analysis.
So I think as of now, the prevailing approach to multi-methods research in political science is that you do like a frequentist regression for your quant stuff, and then you go do some case studies applying some version of process tracing or some other qualitative method. And then you try to kind of like triangulate across these results that are actually coming from epistemologically very different methods that don't speak directly to each other. So absolutely, we would say Bayesianism allows us to bridge all these divides. And our sort of solution to the epistemological mismatch problem in the multi-methods research is to just use Bayesianism for all components of your research, right? So if you, for example, you could run Bayesian regressions or do a Bayesian model comparison with your sort of large and quantitative data. And then the posterior odds that you come out with from that component of research would just become the prior odds when you go on to do your case studies or some other component of your research. Or vice versa, right? If you start with your case studies, then the posterior odds that come out of your qualitative research would then become the prior odds for a quantitative Bayesian model comparison with some large N data.
So one last question. We were saying, there's been all this development in process tracing methodology and within case analysis methodology, to which your propose an amazing contribution that it's about generating metrics for confidence, and what kind of hypothesis test can be made to making statements more rigorous, and what kind of evidence can be offered to others to say, well, this is the level of uncertainty of the things I'm saying. So it seems to me that Mill's classical comparative method, which we all learn, of similarity and difference, seems to be so far away from what we actually do nowadays that I wonder if that really belongs to science history now, or is there a role for the classic comparative method in this discussion? Are we moving away from comparisons?
I don't think we need to move away from comparisons. I think that there's definitely room for, and there should be room for, comparative methods in political science, and certainly within a Bayesian framework, comparative case studies fit perfectly well. I think we've gone beyond Mills, where we're now recognizing, certainly within a Bayesian framework, that there's no fundamental difference between doing a single case study and doing multiple case studies within a Bayesian framework. So regardless, we're always asking which hypothesis makes the evidence expected. And the inferential weight of the evidence is going to aggregate across cases in the same way that it would aggregate within a given case as we discover more clues. So this is, I think, it's a very nice framework for resolving some of these debates that I think are still raging about, what's the difference between process tracing and comparative methods, or, what is the traditional comparative method. I think there's still a lot of debate about what exactly that is, right? And here I want to give a shout out to Peter Hall. So I would say that his work on comparative methods, in my view, is a pretty good intuitive approximation to the kind of Bayesian framework that we're advocating in our book. So his 2003 piece, where he talks about systematic process analysis, basically involves asking how well the evidence fits with expectations of one theory compared to a rival, and then updating prior odds. So he's not using Bayesian terminology, but that's pretty much the underlying idea. And then all of the information that we're learning from the cases is contributing to our inference about these hypotheses for understanding, for example, how democratic mobilization came about in Southeast Asia, or how and when is it that economic elites are able to deter initiatives to tax their income and wealth in democracies.
Great. Well, thank you, Tasha, so much for joining us here at the Albert Hirschman Center. Well, tell people where they can find out more about your work on methods and other issues.
Pretty much all of our articles posted on my Wix webpage. It's tasha.fairfield at Wix. And yeah, I would encourage folks, if they're interested, to have a look at that. And I'm always happy to talk to people about Bayes. So if there are pressing questions about Bayesianism and methods out there, send me an email. I'm happy to engage.
Wonderful. Well, I'm Matias Lopez. I'm a postdoc fellow here at the Albert Hirschman Center for Democracy. I just talked with Professor Tasha Fairfield, who's a professor of political science at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Please stay tuned to the other podcast productions of the center, and I hope to see you next time.
And Matias, I wanted to say on recording, thank you so much for having me. It was delightful.